presentation. It's joint work together with my advisor, Ashish Goel, who's also here, with Son Jinim from UC Merced and Kamesh Munagala at Duke. And some of the work that I'm presenting here was based on a paper that we presented earlier in Equity and Access and Algorithms, Mechanisms, and Optimization conference that was 2 weeks ago. When we want to organize civic processes or some kind of diversity and optimization, diversity and representation in the various viewpoints is really essential. This is not only when we're looking at elections, but also when we want to get some kind of optimal turnout, but also when we run like a feedback process or a survey. There's a few different approaches that we could use that are commonly used in this space. So for example, you could have some kind of a mini public where you use sortition to arrive at a random sample that is explicitly invited to participate in that exercise. Which is often it's very helpful if you want to get a representative sample, but the downside of that is that often engagement and educational understanding of like what the survey is all about is an explicit goal of organizations to run a participatory process in the first place. A second approach that is often used is to increase participation rates in some way of underrepresented groups. That could be through awareness campaigns, it could be targeted advertising that we published earlier work on, or it could be simply through outreach to underrepresented groups or some kind of channels that reach different people. This is especially an important method if you have a one person, one vote kind of situation, like actual elections, where it's ethically kind of dubious to do anything else than that. The third option that is to our availability would be to adjust the outcomes or to adjust the way we represent the outcomes through some kind of weighting on demographic characteristics, which especially applies to civic processes where we are trying to present what the outcome would have been if there would have been a representative sample. This is not always possible because we may not have demographic information or it may not be relevant at all. And it may also be kind of, it may be normatively dubious in certain situations. There's two motivating examples I want to give for our work. The first is that the situation in Finland, where Aitamuto et al. Described in 2013 their legislative consultation in Finland, where they try to crowdsource opinions to answer the question where snowmobiles in the winter should be allowed to go for off-road traffic. In their analysis, they identified two clusters, one minority and one majority cluster. In the complex opinion space, it was really along demographic lines, but these demographic lines were not necessarily foreseen. So we see that there's this majority cluster, which is mostly male snowmobile drivers, and you have this minority cluster, which is like a coalition of different groups. And this cluster representation turned out to be quite useful information for the decision makers. A second example that we can talk about is based on the paper that we presented a few weeks ago at AMO, which is a feedback exercise that we did with the city of Austin in 2020. And we had two main questions that we wanted to get an answer to in this exercise. The first was if the city would have to increase their revenue, like they had a few different knobs to turn on. Which of these revenue sources would get most support to see an increase? For example, property tax or various service fees. The second question was that if the residents would be able to redistribute the budget between different departments, how would they do that so? We knew that the police department, which was one of these departments, was going to be a divisive issue in the city because that was already known for several years. Besides these two questions, which all had their own section, we had a third section where we were asking people about their demographic information. And 2020 turned out to be a very tumultuous year. Besides the worldwide pandemic that changed how people interacted with the city and how they live, and there were also a lot of protests, especially in the United States, surrounding violence from law enforcement towards Black people. And in the middle of this survey, George Floyd was killed by law enforcement in Minneapolis, which is not close to Austin in Texas, but this event really changed the landscape of in the United States. It's well documented that this was a major shock to the American society, not necessarily as in that it was something totally new, but it really was an emotional shock. The immediate effect on our exercise was that where people could give feedback on the police budget, they find the number of responses increased with 100-fold, basically overnight. So in line with econometric literature, we will refer to it as an exogenous shock, as this killing and the subsequent protests. After this shock, and a dramatic increase in responses, we noted some changes in the demographics as well. Respondents were much younger and more likely to rent their home rather than to own it than before the shock, and then it would be the case in the census. But to my personal surprise, and maybe to some of you, there was not much of a shift along racial or ethnic lines, which you would naively perhaps expect. What was very clear is that the dramatic increase of support to reduce the funding for the police, that increased from 43% before the shock to 93% after the shock. And it was not just the amount of support to decrease it to any level, but it was also the extent to which people wanted to decrease that funding. However, based on this data alone, it was not actually immediately clear whether this was the shift of responses was really some kind of differential turnout, or whether there was maybe an opinion change. So in the paper, we show that there was at least a fair amount of opinion change that was underpinning these shifts. But I won't go too much into detail for that in the interest of time. I would encourage you to read that paper. What is more relevant to this, from this motivating example for this presentation, is that we were able to identify 3 very robust and well-defined clusters in this data. On the right side, you see the cluster centroids from the main set of questions in the survey, and at the top, you see the various categories of revenue sources, and at the bottom, you see the various questions about the expenditure side. And these centroids are displayed with a 95% confidence interval after resampling and reclustering, which shows that the centroids are pretty stable. But more noteworthy might be even that these centroids are also very meaningful in a societal context. And we were much better able to explain the events using this information than we would be using any analysis on demographic lines. For example, if we analyze the cluster distributions over time, we see that the cluster that was strongest in support of cutting police budgets, which is the red cluster here, cluster 0, barely existed before the shock. While the cluster that was least in support of cutting police funding, which would be cluster 1, the green one, was dominating at that time period. And with that, after that shock, you really see a big shift in how these clusters were existing compared to each other. With the data from the subsequent year, we were able to confirm that these clusters were indeed meaningful and that there was a lasting shift that was the case. Clustering multidimensional opinion data like this proved to be a very useful tool to understand what exactly happened in a way that we were unable to do with demographic analysis. The clusters in the follow-up survey also confirmed that these clusters captured persistent opinions. However, an approach like this is somewhat ad hoc. It's not immediately clear what we would be able to connect back to it and how it would fit into a budgeting decision. What would you do if this kind of analysis shows that there are actual concerns with regards to minority opinions? It would need some kind of formal model that can be used to inform the final decision in a more principled way. A principled approach has to account for underrepresented minority opinions without having a demographic-based notion of who constitutes that minority. It would have to be robust to underrepresentations under any dimensions, and not just demographic lines that we can predict, but also the less obvious ones. But these fault lines and opinions may not be aligned with demographics at all. They may not be able to capture that information from the survey in the first place. Or even if we could capture that information, it might be a very complex intersection of various causes, like we saw in the case of Finland, which is hard to know in advance. So for a more principled approach, we could consider the idea of a pure opinion minority. Without knowing anything about the demographics, let's assume that there are n participants and let pi be the weight that we give to an opinion of participant I. We could put a lower and upper bound on these weights to make sure that everyone has a roughly similar input on the decision or on the aggregate. And this allows us to find a minority coalition that can be upweighted. For example, if alpha is 0.9 over n and beta is 2 over n, we allow for a coalition of roughly 10% of the population to be doubled in their weight, correcting for the fact that they are half the size of what you would normally expect. Now we have a representational polytope with all the possible weights that fit these constraints. Each point in the polytope would correspond with how with some kind of reweighting of the underlying population, and each point we can define a weighted aggregate of these results. With this set of definitions, we have essentially three ways to look at the issue. So first, we can generate alternate aggregates. What would have happened if the turnout would have been different? If the group of up to 10% in this case, in our example, would have showed up double as much, what would the aggregate have looked like? It might be useful for civic planners to look at the entire set to get an understanding of how robust their process outcome is to a variance in turnout. Secondly, we can find the dissenters. We can understand which coalition minority, which point of the polytope basically would have an associated solution that is furthest away from our original aggregate. What minority set would change the solution the most if they would turn out in larger numbers? And finally, we could find some kind of robust aggregate, a single solution that maximizes the minimum utility for each of these points, each of these alternate realities in the presentation polytope. We find this this nested optimization problem. So D is a penalty function here for participant I that they would get from the aggregate solution X. So X is the original aggregate solution, and Xi is the new solution, is their own preference. And for each of the aggregate solutions, we define a worst distance to be the highest distance that any allowed reweighting could have given our constraints. So in this example, 0.9 and 2 would practically come down again to the aggregate solution where 10% of a coalition of 10% would be upweighted to 100%. And then we can find the aggregate solution that has the smallest worst distance. When we apply this to the Austin data, we actually see that a robust solution results in a further degree of police funding, of reducing police funding. A small majority of the people that would be upweighted would indeed belong to cluster 0, which we identified before. Cluster 0 being the people who are most in favor of cutting the police funding in Austin. This would be the people. These are probably the people that chose the maximum, or almost the maximum, decrease in police funding permitted, which we capped at 5% in our survey. Different choices of alpha and beta gave a qualitatively similar result. So we believe with this kind of approach, we could give decision makers an alternative way of looking at these results, understand better what fractures in the opinion spectrum exist, and perhaps if you combine it with the demographic information, better understand where the minorities of certain opinions live without looking at the predefined notions of what minorities have to look like in a certain context. These are some of the citations, and thank you for your attention.